Hello, folks. Welcome back to this week's edition of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We are recording this episode on September 10th. It's going to air September 17th, and you may be listening to this on a podcast at some point between the 17th and the middle to end of October. And this is a great time for us to start thinking about the role of early decision and early action in your college application plan. So for those of you who are watching this video on YouTube, you can see that I've got Julia Jones here to join me to talk about this. Julia, hey, welcome to the show today.
Hey, Ian, how are you?
I'm doing really well. It's good to have you here and to unpack, I think, a topic that we speak about all of the time. It's something that to us, I think, can be very clear, but I think it creates a lot of challenges for families to understand when is the appropriate time to use early action. How should I think about early decision? And especially some of the, I hate to use this word, but some of the strategy that can be associated with that. And I think we want to unpack a little bit of that in this segment for today. So maybe we can just start with definitions, because I think that's one of the clearest spaces where people can get confused. So let's just start with early action. Do you want to give us a definition for early action?
Sure. Early action is, I think, a little easier to unpack. It is basically an early notification and an early application plan, right? So the deadlines can vary, but typically they are early November, early to mid-November. And so you're putting in an application in, kind of on the early side. And in return, you hear earlier. So you can hear anywhere from mid-December to late December, even early January in some cases, but definitely before, April and before a lot of the other regular decisions come back. So, yeah.
And so given that it's earlier, and you've got to sort of get your stuff together a little bit earlier, you've got to apply earlier than maybe you would otherwise, sometimes a full 2 months ahead of time. What are the advantages to applying early action? Why would a student take advantage of that early action option?
Right. Well, I think obviously the biggest advantage is you get some decisions in early. In some cases it might be a nice holiday gift to get that accepted right before the holidays. Yeah. So I think you do hear earlier. And I think that, from a college perspective and from a strategy standpoint, you're showing a college that you are ready, that you are, interested enough in them to get your application in, on the early side. So, and it gives colleges, I think they appreciate it for a lot of reasons, knowing that you're interested, being able to make some decisions and get, especially those, students that they really want in their class, giving them that notification early. It gives them more time to then recruit you and to woo you, once they've sent those decisions out. So
that's right. Yeah. From the standpoint of the college, it gives them sort of an early glance at what the applicant pool is going to look like in general. We don't typically see a much different pool, I think, in early action versus regular decision. It might be a little bit stronger, but that typically doesn't have any negative impact on the students that are applying. I do think that as contrasted with early decision, which we'll talk about, early action doesn't typically give the student a leg up in terms of the admission decision, or if there is one, it's fairly small. So early action, you're probably going to have about the same chances of getting in early action as you would regular decision for a given school that offers both rounds. Are there any drawbacks, Julia, that you see to applying early action for a particular student?
Really more of a question of readiness too. I think for some students, if you're not ready to apply early action, because it is accelerating the process. So, you might want to take more time with your essays. You don't want to rush the process. And so, there's no point in getting an application, out there if you really feel like you could have used that extra month or so to really perfect it. The other possibility is that, for students who really want senior grades and senior year to count more in the process, the downside to early action for some students is that, they're not going to see much of any of your senior year. Your senior report cards aren't even out yet. So for the first quarter. So I think for some students, if they feel like, I really maybe junior year was a great year, and I want to see that trend. I think colleges are going to really want to see that trend. Then yes, I think there's some value to perhaps waiting. And I think also, this year, especially with all the uncertainty around testing can sometimes have, you may not be able to take testing if you're hoping that that's going to be a part of the process. That too can, maybe an argument for holding off.
I think it's worthwhile to also just explore that, the decision that you get from early action is not binary. So it's not just in or out, but there's also a possibility for a postponement or a deferral. And so what that means is the school gets your application and they decide either they need more information from you, and that could sometimes be fall grades. Maybe it could be test scores if you've indicated that you're planning to take a test, but you haven't reported scores yet. Maybe it's just wanting to see what the strength of the pool looks like overall, right? A college might say, we don't know if this student is going to be competitive in the regular round, and so we're going to postpone that student and reconsider when we see the entirety of that regular round. And I think that the availability of that postponement, that deferral, is really great because it helps to give some confidence to students that even if they're not accepted, they might still have an opportunity to get in during that regular decision round. And I think if we talked about what to do between that decision and, in the spring, we'd probably fill up the whole segment. So we'll leave that for another day. Yeah. What about, there's a very rare round of early action called restrictive early action. It's only offered by a very small handful of schools. Do you want to explain just briefly what that looks like?
Sure. And it looks a little different from school to school, but essentially, well, you're not committing to a school if you're applying early action, regardless of whether it's restricted or not. You're still
Right.
open and allowed to, compare all of your acceptances, all of your awards, and make your final choice in May. But restricted early action basically means that you cannot apply to all schools early action. So I think, what they're basically saying is that you're not committing to us you don't have to attend, but you cannot apply to any other schools early. You're
Right.
really just committing to us in terms of the early application. With some exceptions, there are some schools that allow you to apply to public universities or universities that may have an early deadline for scholarship. But for the most part, if you're applying to, like, say, for example, Stanford, that has a restricted early action, that's the only early school that you're really going to be allowed, or private university that you're going to be allowed to apply to.
Right. And this is a policy that is offered at Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I think those are.
Princeton is doing that this year, but yeah, I think
Princeton, they might not be doing it this year, but historically have. And so you can sort of see, just by virtue of which schools offer it, what the objective is. The objective is that those schools don't want to compete with each other for the same kids. And so they're basically deciding you can choose one of the four of us, but not all of us. And that is a little bit of an opportunity for that school to know that student is that's their first choice, and to start that recruitment process a little bit earlier, as you mentioned, Julia. You touched on some priority deadlines, which are not early action or early decision, but just deadlines to hit if you want to be considered for scholarships. It's a great idea to do those wherever you can. And then there's also a rolling admission process. I just wanted to touch on that just ever so briefly before we turn to early decision. Do you want to sort of just describe the rolling admission opportunity?
Sure. Rolling admission is basically, there's no set deadline. There might be a final or a deadline or a priority deadline, but basically colleges just open up the application process on a certain date. Often it's in early fall. And anytime from that moment on, you can put in an application. And when your application is complete, they start reviewing your application and we'll make a decision, and we'll get a decision back to you within a set time frame, usually 10 weeks or so, give or take a few weeks. So it can be, again, and it's another way of hearing from a school early. Typically schools that do rolling admission, they're admitting really, all the way through, but it is most students benefit to apply on the early side of that equation. For more competitive schools, for more competitive majors, they're admitting until they're full. So if you are waiting until, March of your senior year, technically you can still get your application in, but there may not be space available at that point. So
right. The analogy I like to use is, imagine there's a house party and they've got capacity for 100 people. If you show up right when the party starts, there's more room inside. So they're more likely to let you in. But if you wait until late, they might say, we've only got room for 5 more people in here, and you don't look like you've showered lately, so take a walk, right? Maybe that's just me. So that's rolling. Let's talk about early decision, because I think this is where a lot of confusion obtains. I think it's where there's a lot of stress, because it is a committed, binding process, right? Do you want to describe just the way early decision works from the standpoint of the students, both in terms of the deadlines and then also their obligation to the schools?
Sure. It's very similar in many ways to early action in terms of just the timeline and the deadlines. The deadlines are sometimes they can be identical, or just same idea. November-ish. You hear early in usually in December. The biggest difference is the commitment level that you're making to the school. So, you are unlike early action where you can wait and make your final choice much later and compare awards. For early decision, you are essentially signing a contract with the school. It's a binding agreement that states, yes, you're my first choice, and if I'm admitted, I will attend.
Right.
Period. The end. So,
right.
We're taking all others and all of that. So that's the biggest change and the biggest difference. I think you can only obviously apply to one early decision school, and or at least one at a time.
One at a time, right?
There are schools that have early decision round 2, which is a little bit later. It's typically in January, and same idea though. You hear a little bit earlier, but the trade-off is you have to attend.
That's right. And there are financial sort of implications here. We're going to talk about that in our next segment with our college finance expert. So we'll leave that untouched here, but you'll want to come back and listen to that final segment to hear more about it. But I do want to sort of talk about that early decision round 1 and round 2. I think some people get a little confused about that. From the standpoint of a student looking at ED1, ED2, can they apply to both? And in what circumstance would they want to do so?
You can apply to both. I think that's kind of what they're designed for in some ways. I think that it's typically, obviously it's your first choice. So if it's the same idea, the same concept of decisions when you get, as it would be for early action. So you have either, if you're accepted early action round 1, that's it, you're done. You can celebrate and be happy.
Early decision. If you're accepted early decision.
Early decision, yeah. Right. If you are not accepted early decision round 1, you're going to get, same as early action, kind of one of 2 possible outcomes. You might be deferred into the regular admission pool, in which case that commitment is no longer present. So you are now just treated as a regular applicant. Or you might be, in some cases, denied admission if they know that it's just not going to be possible even later on. They want to let you off the hook.
And that's final. You can't reapply regular decision. You can't reapply for early decision round 2. If you're denied in an early round, you're denied for that
year. It is done. Yeah. Exactly. And that frees you up in both cases, whether you're deferred or denied. You have the option then, if you have a second first choice, you can apply early round 2 for some schools. And some students will look at that and say, okay, so if I don't get into, school A early decision round 1, I'm going to go and, do this other school for round 2. Some students also use round 2 as just their way. They may not be ready, as we talked about earlier with early action. They may not be ready for the November deadline, but they still want to do early decision. And so round 2 can be a way to do that.
So why would a student choose to apply early decision, and especially at a school, because some schools offer early action, early decision 1, early decision 2, some even offer an early action 2. Now, there are a lot of possibilities, and you can see those things simultaneously at the same institution. Usually schools will have some subset of these. But let's say I'm a student and I love a school. I know it's my first choice. They offer both early action and early decision. They have the same deadline. Why would I choose early decision over early action?
Right. Well, I think first of all, you have to think about it from a standpoint of, okay, is it your first choice?
Yes.
If it's not your first choice, and you're really not sure, you want to take a step back.
Right.
But if it is your first choice, and it also is a school that might be a little harder to get into, so you might be a little bit below the average. So it's a reach in that way. That's where the strategy comes in that you mentioned earlier. So unlike early action. Early decision for colleges, for them, it's a win as well. You're 100% guaranteed that you're going to be in their class. Right. And there's so much, they're going to be competing and recruiting students in the spring. The fewer students they have to worry about, the better. The more, so I think that's for colleges, and it's also a positive. Colleges love to see students who are,
Yeah,
making that kind of commitment. I
they're
mean,
excited.
who wouldn't?
Sure.
So yeah, so I think that that's really the strategy that you can use, and that's why students often do that. But I often caution students to say, I've got to apply ED somewhere.
Ooh,
That's not necessarily
yeah,
the approach to have, because you don't know if you're going to have a first choice, and
that's right.
especially this year, that's harder to discern because you haven't necessarily been able to visit every school and to make that final choice. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it's sort of like deciding that you're going to go out car shopping and I'm going to leave today, the end of the day, with a car. And whether a good deal comes out or not, you sort of are, okay, well, I guess I'm going to choose one. You don't want to lock yourself into that sort of pre-commitment unless you're ready to do so. You want all the information at your fingertips. You want to be completely prepared to be able to commit. And that takes some time. It takes some consideration, and it's not right for everyone. And so I have heard a lot of students that are like, I got to figure out my ED school. And I always have to remind them, look, you might not have one, and that's fine. I talked to a student just last week who was trying to consider different ED options. And I said, well, what's your first choice? And she said, University of Washington. And I said, well, Washington doesn't offer ED. They don't offer EA. They only offer RD. And so if you apply ED somewhere else, you'll never get to find out if you got into Washington. You'll never get the chance to attend. So ED is not for you. And we decided, okay, we're not going to do the ED. So, I think you really want to think about, first of all, where does your heart and your interest lead you? And then we can sort of think about how different rounds of admission opportunities might give you the best chance of getting into the schools that you want to get into. But we don't want the strategy to lead the decision here. We want our preferences to lead that decision.
100%. Yeah.
Any sort of final tips that you would give just in the last few seconds here, Julia?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've said is exactly right, and that's the advice I give every student is, making sure that your whatever policy and whatever plan you have for both early action, early decision, it's got to make sense for what you're looking for and what's going to be a good fit for you, and also your own timeline too.
Yeah.
Whether that means, whatever that means in terms of, getting the applications done, and getting them right too. And so in some ways that for many students, early action, early decision can be a good way to do that. But in some students, they want the extra time. So
Definitely.
take the time that you need, and also make the right choice in terms of, if you're committing to a school, make sure it's for the right reasons too.
That's right. That's right. Team right reasons. So that's a great place to leave it. We've addressed the admission side. We're going to talk about the finance side in just a moment. Julia, thanks a lot for coming on the show today and helping our listeners to understand this a little better.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
You got it. Folks, we'll be right back, so don't go away.